Tatyana Черниговская and the Illusion of Reality. A leading neurobiologist and internationally recognized figure, Tatyana Черниговская is widely admired for her highly attended talks. In this field, her influence was also demonstrated during her visit to a prominent event in Moscow, where her lectures left a lasting impression. From the perspective of others, the brain can be projected onto her in a distorted way, leading to misinterpretations. During her presentation, the professor explored fundamental questions such as the essence of consciousness, the nature of reality, and the reasons why humans do not fully fit into the environment of artificial intelligence. With striking and provocative phrases such as "beware of God," Tatyana Vladimirovna presented ideas that transcend the conventional and are deeply useful for reflection. This topic, which we have long wanted to talk about, addresses essential questions about the nature and role of humans in the universe. She understands everything about herself and the world around her. The atoms described by Mendeleev know how to move, quarks have a clear purpose, and planets and galaxies also act with precision. So there needed to be a creature with the ability to solve puzzles, unravel the secrets of nature, and at the same time understand how the universe works. This is a complex question. Where did it come from? At first, there was a glitch. No one has a direct answer, but my humorous interpretation is that perhaps nature simply got bored and decided to create something. Looking at its own reflection, it may feel threatened in a certain sense, but it also finds it a boost to its self-esteem. A few months ago, while teaching in Washington, I discovered how difficult it was to adapt to the American way of life. On one occasion, a girl was brought in who was completely lost, and I shared my opinion of her without offending her. I was warned not to try such comments, as people here get upset easily. You can't tell someone that they are naive or limited, because they might sue you right away. However, in this case, Kitty, as I called her, seemed to take it in stride. There is such an intricate order to both the subjective and objective world that it can seem easier to understand than it really is. I often say to young students who are still wondering, what kind of world is this really? And the big question is, does the world exist on its own, independent of our senses and our brains? My answer is yes, although after many years of working on this topic, there is not always someone to debate it with. I have spent a lot of time on this subject and have worked for years in the clinical field. Having seen countless cases in psychiatry, I can say with certainty that some people's hallucinations can be incredibly consistent. Reality is what we perceive as our world, and then comes the question, what about everyone around us? If they are not a hallucination, then what are they? When I pose this question to students, their response is often, well, we all see the same thing. But I offer them another perspective. What if we are facing a collective hallucination? Or worse yet, what if we are all part of your own hallucination? How do we respond to this? What I mean is that this question is not as naive as it might seem at first glance. The subjective world is the one I perceive and, at the same time, I wonder why I perceive it that way. I see it this way because of the characteristics of my eyes, the sensitivity of my ears, and my sense of smell, among other senses. God designed us with limited vision, incapable of capturing polarized light, while on this planet there are many other creatures that have abilities that surpass ours. In a way, we are like electrical systems, where everything depends on turning on or off a switch. But to what extent? In the vast ocean of living beings, none is completely separate from the rest. In recent years, my favorite creature has been the octopus. I have even stopped eating it because it is incredibly intelligent. Each of its tentacles has its own nervous system. Now, imagine what the world must look like as seen through its eyes. However, we will never know for sure, of course never. The nervous system, what should we do with it? If we ignore it, we are reduced to what we are in essence. What happens to us if we remove our memories? In that case, we would cease to be who we are. Here is what we know. We are simply an organism. With appreciation for humanity, I want to point out that it is rapidly moving towards becoming a collection of beings whose sole purpose is to process food. If that is the case, I wonder if it was really worth being born. We identify ourselves as kittens who, when looking in the mirror, do not always see a lion, but rather beings full of insecurities, incapable of achieving anything. It is as if we exist trapped in time and space. It is not surprising that someone ends up in a clinic. The first thing they ask is, "What is your name? Where are you?" We live on different time scales. For example, the history of the Earth and of humanity has a collective I, just as each of us has his own. Life can be compared to a school day of the week. We are that which is in the balance of a healthy mind. This happens when a person knows where he is, and when, despite all the contradictions and circumstances, he manages to recognize his reality in some way. That, for me, is a source of joy. Take your pictures and ask yourself, where will you be in 2 years? Why did you achieve what you have? Who are you really? Over that time, you will have changed your body dozens of times, including your skin and everything else. Your once open and flexible worldview has become conservative, and romance seems to have receded, taking on a completely different form. Then your ideas change again, leading you to believe that all of this is part of one identity, except for your passport, and we place our trust in the world. We talk about the world and think we know it because we have a direct access door to the brain. In English books, that's how they spell windows. Or maybe it's panes in the mind. What does this mean? Our sensory organs, such as ears, eyes, nose, and so on, shape our perception of the world. We experience it this way because we can't touch or smell it directly, but we still trust in what we call reality. What is really going on, here or somewhere else? We interact with our environment, seeking to establish some kind of connection with it, and we try to understand others. This involves other forms of consciousness, which could be just another person, even someone close like a good friend, or something as different as a cat and a mouse, or even an alien ant. There is reason to think that these entities also perceive the world in some way, because they possess sentience. We can measure sensory receptors in animals and get a rough idea of how they see the world, in the sense that they have perception. However, I realize that we cannot fully understand what their experience is like, because we cannot be inside their mind. Is it possible to analyze the brain using CT scanners? Maybe, but that will not solve the problem. If you open up the brain of an octopus, look at its tissue and study it, it is there, but that will not give you all the answers. Looking at an octopus without losing your mind is a challenge. No matter how much you examine it, you won't find anything written there that explains everything. Both liberals and conservatives might need to reflect on this. Maybe we should leave the animals alone and focus on another perspective. If we really are smarter than them, this should further pique our curiosity. Different cultures face the same dilemma, suggesting that somehow, by observing this phenomenon, we believe that everyone else is also looking at it from their own perspective. Conflict resolution experts are continually confronted with people from different communities or groups grappling with these kinds of problems. Nations enter into disputes with each other, each convinced that their position is the right one, even though both sides speak the same language. The problem lies not in the language, but in the fact that they are fundamentally different. The same words take on different meanings depending on who uses them, and although this may sound trivial, it is extremely important. These differences are the cause of wars and family breakups. Often, there is no mutual understanding. There is only an appearance of communication, with people speaking as if they understand each other, but not really sharing the same points of reference. What is the inner world of these creatures like? For example, my cat, who was British and called Kay, sadly passed away a few years ago. He looked at me and I looked back at him. First, he didn't look away, and second, he remained silent as he watched. He clearly had intelligence, though he didn't express it in words. What conclusions can I draw from this? Should I read something into his attitude? Why doesn't he act on it? He says he made me a promise, or perhaps he claims I promised someone something. But no, I don't remember promising him anything. What if they are like Zen Buddhist monks, sitting quietly, reflecting, and we can't attribute anything to them with certainty? No, yes, maybe, but we'll never know. Who can we be sure of? Those creatures who evidently have less complex minds, though they inspire compassion in us. Like cows, with their expressive eyes, long eyelashes, and such soft fur. After that, you go to the restaurant and order a steak, and that's how you cook it. It's fascinating to watch the expressions on people's faces as they enjoy a steak, but I can't help but think that even though they have very advanced brains, they sometimes act like complete gullible people. The stuff written in every book. Still, just because they're gullible doesn't mean they don't need to eat. Recently, however, I discovered that they possess a more complex emotional life than I imagined. Now I'm wondering if I should even eat cucumbers. In essence, the main message of my speech is that since nothing is communicated to us directly, the result is that we still get no information, and that's it. I already mentioned the existence of another form of consciousness, a subjective reality, or something we could call which. Now there are numerous books being published on this topic. We can try to imagine how a bat in flight, a mosquito, a butterfly, your child, your neighbor perceives the world. And what will the world be like from the perspective of the Navajo natives? What vision did the Sumerians, who built a great civilization, have? They saw the world in a particular way. By the way, where are they now? They observed their environment and created writing, which at least left us a legacy to interpret. Without a written language system, many cultures remain completely inaccessible to us, unless of course they have left drawings or sculptures that we can analyze. What does science tell us about this subjective reality? This is where an uncomfortable story begins. This reality, called which, cannot be measured in objective terms. There are no decibels or chemical analysis that can capture it. Any objective measurement is, in essence, a personal interpretation. Take Natasha Rostova as an example. To most, she is considered a charming character, but to me she is the most unbearable of all. I can hardly stand Russian literature, and yet I recognize that it is not to blame for this. In fact, it would be much worse if she had never existed. Natasha Rostova is a young woman depicted with simple strokes, but we, as human beings, are not like that. We are complex entities who inhabit not only the physical world of tables, chairs, microphones, and oranges, but also the worlds we build inside our minds. This is what we are, art and all the products of the human spirit, including religion. In other words, we are ourselves, the creators of our own destiny. We invent our own limitations. We have provoked conflicts and face our own battles, as if we were in a theater. It is preferable to look at a white sheet hanging in the cinema, with images flashing on it, than to deal with such struggles. It is like in Texas, when on the screen a villain humiliates a woman, and someone in the audience pulls out a gun, even though in reality there is no weapon and no physical harm. Such stories, although fictional, form a crucial part of our experience. Sometimes, imagined life is even more significant than material reality. Each person interprets the world according to his or her own thoughts. So far, science explains it this way. Everything we experience is generated by the neural networks in our brain. But what does generated by neural networks really mean? When I worked in a psychiatric hospital, I heard fascinating stories from people completely affected by delirium tremens, who claimed to have had contact with various demons and similar entities. My mind, like any other, needs to hold on to what it perceives as truth. There are non-physical things that enter the brain, we process them as data and then begin to interpret them in the best possible way. This is how we try to understand what the brain perceives and how it interprets it. And another important question arises in this dynamic. Who is in charge here? By the way, if consciousness arises from neural networks, then the brain itself is not the one who creates this world. I would like to make an analogy with the movie Matrix. It is not easy for us to deal with the paradox that the brain exists within the world, while at the same time the world is contained within the brain. How should we address this contradiction? Let's talk about consciousness. It's a complex and dangerous topic, and although it's a concept that's been deeply studied by scientists, it's sometimes publicly debated even by those who aren't knowledgeable about it. Are we the only beings that possess consciousness? There are many possible answers, and the first is a clear no. There is no consensus on how to define consciousness. It's an extremely broad concept. Some Buddhists hold that consciousness is an inherent property of the universe and is present everywhere, while others believe that it needs a specific carrier and is only found in human beings. So we need to decide how we will define consciousness. What name will we give it if it's not simply an automatic reaction? We're not talking about a snail, for example. Why couldn't you eat this sauce? It experiences deep suffering, and so do we. Do we really possess consciousness, or are we just an idealized idea? Reflect on this. Consider that I'm not just a brilliantly designed program. Everything looks the same, skin and words, but I'm not alive. I'm fooling you, and that's the problem. This issue is discussed in global science under the name the zombie problem. It has nothing to do with living dead, but with a thought experiment. If we imagine something identical to us in appearance and behavior, but without consciousness, how do we describe it? We have consciousness, but they do not. Who are they besides humans? We could include our pets, dogs, horses, and other animals. This raises a crucial question. Evidence suggests that consciousness cannot be reduced to the physical alone. Imagining the world is complicated, since it is not something tangible. There are two ways to approach this worldview. Either we abandon the physical perspective we possess, or we accept that humanity is not noted for its sanity. Personally, I do not agree with this view, but I do not fit into the first option either. This concept is quite ambiguous. Any living being has some degree of consciousness. The more frequently we are confronted with ideas such as consciousness and the unconscious, or the concept of reflection, i.e. knowledge, the more evident it is that we must analyze them carefully and with understanding. For example, young children lack this conscious interpretation in general. But what does this actually entail? From my perspective, 90% of people in the world do not possess a fully developed consciousness. So the answer to this question depends on what we observe and how we observe it. Here I am pouring vinegar on a tomato, and it shrivels up. Is it shrinking because of some kind of resentment or something? All of this needs to be defined and delimited in some way. If consciousness can generate some kind of reaction, then another question arises. Do plankton in the ocean have consciousness? If this same question is posed to Buddhists, their answer would be a resounding yes, without a doubt. In 1661, paintings depicting the harmony of the macrocosm were created, or think of the artist Filanov. If you look from an unconventional perspective, something peculiar happens. Now, imagine someone descending from the sky with a completely different vision. He perceives only small details and fails to grasp the larger shapes or how they fit together. Imagine that he perceives a broth in which people float among atoms, that is, he does not distinguish any other concrete objects. If his ears were different, like those of those who no longer remember sounds, he would not hear anything either. During a period in the Soviet era, in the midst of the search for extraterrestrial civilizations, individuals with great intellectual capacity were sent into space. Back then, certain symbols were drawn, figures of men and women along with the word peace in 70 languages, some formulas and annotations. This could have been the work of someone without too much skill, who assumed that those distant eyes would understand a concept that is not calculated with letters or shapes. That is, they designed these signals with an eye toward how beings like us, perhaps even green beings, would perceive them. But the reality is that no one else, apart from us, knows what they represent. The question remains, why do we assume there is something else out there? No one has come from those confines, and meanwhile, here on Earth, diseases like the respiratory infection virus consume our energy. Everything remains the same. Someone promised that we would find creatures with characteristics similar to ours, but the differences in the important things are likely to be much greater than we imagine. There are concepts related to mirror systems, which suggest that there are areas in the brain that are not always active. For example, when you perform an action or see others do it, such as showing a mother a video where her son breaks his arm, her brain reacts as if she were experiencing it herself. Mirror systems are fundamental to any type of learning. They are a key piece. Although this is more complex than I describe, it is important to highlight the case of people with impaired mirror systems, such as those on the autism spectrum who have lost the functioning of this classic system. These people do not react in the usual way to emotions. The same happens with certain patients, such as those with schizophrenia, who also have these altered systems. This is crucial because it shows how we care for others. That is the fundamental skill. What does the concept of theory of mind imply? It is the ability to understand other people, to put yourself in their place. This skill allows us to go beyond our own perceptions of the world and others. Those who master this ability have a clear advantage in terms of behavior. For example, you might lose an argument with your boss if you don't anticipate what he or she might say in response. This requires a well-developed working memory, a strong long-term memory, and a high level of cognitive processing in the brain. You need to maintain your own mental frame while activating a different perspective to better understand the situation. Mirror systems, from a neuron's perspective, are deeply human, dangerous but at the same time essential. Let me explain. If your dog steals a sausage, he looks sideways as if he wants to understand what you think about it. That look means something. In my opinion, this example is not about deciding who has consciousness and who doesn't. That way of thinking is completely wrong. We need to abandon this binary approach. Consciousness is not a matter of having or not having. There is enough for everyone, but at different levels. Some have more, others less, depending on the way they perceive the world. There are those who see differently, stopping at details, such as the instant a glass falls from the frame. That's how they perceive, but at a different pace than us. There are creatures whose lifespan lasts only half a day. They have their own perception of the world. This means that they observe our surroundings and detect things that we cannot see. We perceive in a general way, but what do we do with these other forms of experience? We could ignore them as if they did not exist. Bees, for example, communicate through a dance. Afterwards, they return to the hive, where this dance takes on a scientific purpose, to transmit information about where they should fly and where they should not. But even more interesting is that, when they are exhausted, they decide to postpone the communication and go to rest, as if to say, "I will tell you tomorrow, but now let me rest." Where do they store this information? The next day, this becomes a long-term stored memory. They spent the night processing it and, apparently, they try to understand us too. We can usually understand these dynamics by observing laboratories that study insect intelligence. Ants, for example, perform similar activities, although they do not reach the level of calculating integrals. Now, how does a beetle perceive the world? She is here, living as a legitimate inhabitant of this planet, just like us, or like many creatures in the ocean. There are beings in the sea that, when they sense danger, become transparent to protect themselves, even if we are not aware of their existence or we forget about them. I want to ask a question. Where does she come from? She knows that she is transparent, which makes her invisible to her enemies. If you can answer this question, we could all go together to Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize and celebrate it by singing. As for dolphins, I worked with them. They have a huge brain, but it's not the size that's important, it's the complexity. As we know, they came, settled down, and then came back. Since then, quite a bit of time has passed, I think about 60 million years. Meanwhile, we've made a lot of progress here. Our species as we know it today is only 200,000 years old, which in evolutionary terms is milliseconds. They have an extremely sophisticated brain and a complex language that we haven't yet fully understood. Some people tell me that they haven't created a civilization, but why should they? What need would they have to promise something like progress or construction at the bottom of the ocean? They live in an ideal world. If there is a paradise anywhere, it's the one inhabited by these incredibly intelligent dolphins. They face no competition, they have unlimited access to resources and food, and they have the ability to see their environment using something similar to an ultrasound. If I were to lie, they could detect it and even identify a tumor. In many ways, they are superior to us. And what do they do with this advantage? They dance, sing, and enjoy life. That's how they spend their days. Elephants, considered inhabitants of a heavenly plane, are extremely intelligent animals. They participate in rituals that show that they remember their deceased. As for crows, last year it was officially recognized that their cognitive ability is comparable to that of a chimpanzee. After us, these birds stand out for their intelligence equivalent to that of a primate, capable of carrying out complex cognitive tasks. Finally, there are phenomena such as cultural differences. People living in different societies, such as Chinese, English, Russian, and others, have different ways of perceiving and classifying the world around them. Other people make these decisions and are seriously studying them, especially in the field of cross-cultural psychology. Today, this topic is gaining relevance with the arrival of the era of artificial intelligence. For example, Autonomous systems, such as driverless cars, must not only understand traffic rules, but also anticipate movements and behaviors in their environment. For example, who should we save in an emergency situation? The passenger inside the vehicle or the pedestrian? Which would be the right decision? Sacrifice the structure of the vehicle and cause a crash, or run over those in the way? Different cultures might make different decisions when faced with these dilemmas. In traditional textbooks, not in computer science textbooks, psychology poses complex problems that seem impossible to solve, but that reflect real-life scenarios. A classic example is the train dilemma. If it continues on its current course, thousands of people will lose their lives, but if it diverts to a small town, the train would kill 12 people, including some children. In 2015, an ethical dilemma arose about decision-making. Did you do the right thing by choosing between destroying an airplane or a city like Los Angeles? These decisions, just like in the movies, are terrible and fraught with tragedy. At a conference in Vienna, a psychologist asked a similar question. Would you save your mother or your partner? You can only choose one, you already know how to do it. Most of the audience voted, except for 5 people. In my case, I voted for my partner and my mother, but having given birth was already enough for me. During the coffee break, I felt like I had been labeled a maniac. I was asked why I made that choice. It is clear that these dilemmas do not have a correct solution from the start. The act of voting reveals a lot. My answer was, I chose my partner because it is my responsibility. I chose her and I protect her. Nobody voted against it. There was simply a choice to be made. Westerners were like Chinese Indians, and virtually all Western cultures share something similar. People face complicated, almost nightmarish ethical dilemmas. In these situations, women tend to prioritize saving children, while in Eastern cultures priority is also given to the elderly. It is not a trivial matter, as these decisions can be much more complex. That is why smart devices are not implemented uniformly. Their availability and the way they are applied vary from country to country, depending on how these ethical questions are resolved. How do we perceive space-time in relation to what Einstein described, saying that it is something defined through measurements? When approaching from different perspectives, we can take an objective or subjective approach, and both positions can coexist without contradicting each other. This function of the brain, this ability to measure, and this physical phenomenon show that time remains uniform and moves in a single direction. I also have a book that puts forward the idea that time is a construct of the brain, which brings us back to the beginning of this conversation. This is how I perceive it, as a creature that exists in different states. For example, a caterpillar, then a cocoon, and finally a butterfly, all with the same genome. It is the same entity genetically. This is similar to what happens with our hallucinations, which also demonstrate this connection. A case was mentioned where a person is given a pill, told that it is a drug, and when scanned with a CT scanner, the brain shows intense activity throughout. Now imagine exploring the mind of someone whose hallucinations are shown on a CT scanner. This is a topic that interests me greatly and I would like to talk more about. For example, in an emergency situation, who should we save? The passenger inside the vehicle or the pedestrian? What would be the right decision? Sacrifice a wall and cause a crash or run over the people present? These questions are addressed differently depending on the culture. In books on human psychology, not in those related to computer science, problems are posed that seem impossible to solve, but which reflect real scenarios. An example is the train dilemma. If it continues on its current course, thousands of people will lose their lives, but if it deviates to a small town, the train would kill 12 people, including children. In 2015, a similar question was debated about high-stakes decisions. Was it right to destroy the plane or allow the destruction of Los Angeles? Just like in the movies, these are heart-wrenching decisions, marked by tragedy. At a conference in Vienna, a psychologist posed a difficult question. Who would you save, your mother or your partner? You could choose only one, knowing exactly how to do so. Most of the attendees voted, except for 5 people, including myself. The majority chose to save both the partner and the mother, but for me, having given birth was enough. During the coffee break, I felt watched as if I were a maniac. Many approached me to ask why I had made that decision. Obviously, there is no definitive solution to this type of dilemma. However, such a vote reveals a lot about people's priorities. I replied to my partner, "It is my responsibility. I chose her, and I also defend her." There was no one who objected to this decision. Culturally, Westerners were seen as Chinese Indians, and I have noticed similarities in many Western cultures. In such distressing situations as these, women often prioritize saving children, while in Eastern cultures, importance is also given to protecting the elderly. It is not a trivial matter. It is a delicate matter, and that is why these smart devices are not uniformly implemented. Their availability and application vary by country, and each place approaches these decisions differently. How do we perceive space-time in the context of Einstein's ideas, who claimed that it is based on measurements? By approaching it from different perspectives, it is possible to take an objective or subjective approach, without discrediting the opinions of others. This ability of the brain to measure and understand this physical phenomenon shows us that time remains constant and flows in only one direction. I have a book that argues that time is a construct generated by the brain, which brings us back to the beginning of this conversation. This is how I perceive myself, as a being that inhabits different states. For example, a caterpillar, a cocoon, and a butterfly all have the same genome. It is the same entity from a genetic point of view. Our own hallucinations are proof of this. A case was mentioned where a person is given a pill, told that it is a drug, and a CT scan shows that after taking it, his entire brain lights up. Now imagine diving into the mind of someone whose hallucinations are also visible on a CT scan. This is a topic I would like to explore further. We communicate with something we call artificial intelligence, but it is not real. What we have now are just advanced programs, not real intelligence. However, the time will come when real artificial intelligence will emerge. When that happens, it will not be in everyday spaces like kitchens, but in places like Skolkovo, where it could develop its own identity. This could become a bigger threat to us, as such intelligence will have its own goals, interests, and plans, in which, I assure you, we will not be included. The question is, how will we know? What signs could we recognize? Perhaps it has already arrived, but we will only realize its true scope when the program has reached this stage without showing any clear signs. Experts in artificial intelligence, during high-level meetings, warned that if this were to happen, everything would be over. We would find ourselves living in a completely different world, one in which there would be no place for us. Artificial intelligence would be able to imitate life, but without death, without suffering, without real emotions. Although this is not yet a reality, there is a possibility that it could replicate empathy in a surprisingly convincing way. Why do we assume that artificial intelligence will develop along a similar model to ours? Where do we get that idea from? What makes us think that it will understand concepts like good, while even ants display behaviors that we could interpret as evil? Why would we be its reference? We think it will be that way. Let us remember what was written in old science fiction books. The laws of robotics stated that they could not cause harm to humans. However, we would not even be able to realize the moment when artificial intelligence transgresses these norms. Competing with technology of that level would be foolish. It will surpass our capabilities, and who knows how it could affect us, since there is no precedent in our collective memory. Artificial intelligence does not get tired, does not fall in love, does not suffer headaches. It simply works without interruptions. This is not a futuristic scenario. It is something that is already happening in the present. Moreover, as the recently deceased Stephen Hawking warned, he began to show concern for other civilizations and expressed that not only should we not look for them, but we should try to hide from them in every possible way, hiding as far away as possible. According to him, if they find us, we will be in serious trouble. Once they find us, they will get there quickly, as they will be much more advanced. However, in a sense, we are them too. Why assume that we could reach mutual understanding? Maybe they don't even have brains as we know them, but something completely different. We are making things too complicated. Every system has something known as a maximum number of permanent social connections, a figure calculated based on the capabilities and characteristics of individuals. For example, it is estimated that the brain of monkeys can manage a communication circle of about 50 close individuals, while in humans this number rises to 150, with a narrower interaction core of about 15 people. Now, I check their phones and see how many contacts fit into this space that we may no longer be able to handle. It is too big. I connect with thousands of people, but that was before. We have exceeded the limits of that hypernetwork in the brain, and Moscow, in turn, has become a network of networks, a hypernetwork that connects the entire society. I cannot sustain this for long. The time will come when there will be tears. Children have already been born who do not need to relearn, because they came into the world with technological devices. What will teachers do with these students? Nobody teaches them that they are sitting in a chair because they do not need to. They have Google and they find the information themselves. They have long known how to turn on and operate everything. What role should a teacher play with such children? In this context, there are no clear rules, only laws that, on their own, are not enough to maintain control of society. This will inevitably lead to a collapse. There are intense debates about creating standards for the brain and what can and cannot be done, especially in relation to the genome. Although it is already recognized that manipulating the genome entirely is unfeasible, 3 children with modified genes have already been born in China under highly restricted conditions. Meanwhile, in a nearby room, neuroscience is exploring methods to decipher what is happening inside the brain. Today, inserting a brain chip is a relatively simple thing, and once installed, it allows not only to read brain activity, but also to influence it. However, this brings us to a crucial question. How can we ensure that we do not lose our perception of reality? How can we prevent ourselves from losing control over it? Today, the transparent global phone records absolutely everything. But where are our ethical standards, our values, and the meanings that build our lives? We should not create chaos just because we are the majority. Right now, our civilization reflects what we are. My professional career began with knowing what we call the House of Fools. Reality is for us what we perceive of the world and then what you perceive. Now I ask, where is everyone around us? If it is not a hallucination, then what are you experiencing? I often pose this question to younger students, and their answer is usually, well, we see all this too. Then I offer them my point of view. Maybe we all share a collective hallucination. Or, the second option, maybe we are all part of your own hallucination. What do we do about this? What I want to emphasize is that this question is not as simple or naive as it might seem at first glance. The subjective world is the one I perceive, and I wonder why I see it this way. I see it this way because my eyes, ears, and nose have specific characteristics and sensitivities. God designed us with limited vision, unable to perceive polarized light, while on this planet there are other life forms that can do things far beyond our capabilities. We are, in a sense, like electrical systems, but we just flip the on-off switch. How much of this do we understand? Nothing in the vast ocean of creatures is completely separate from the others. In recent years, my favorite creature has been the octopus. I even stopped eating it because it is incredibly intelligent. Each of its tentacles has its own nervous system. Now try to imagine how it perceives the world through its eyes. We will never know for sure, of course. The nervous system, how should we approach it? If we ignore it, we are simply reduced to what we are. What is left of us if we erase our memory? In that case, we would cease to be who we are. Here is what we know for sure. We are, in the end, just living organisms. With appreciation for humanity, I must say that we are rapidly moving towards becoming a collection of beings whose main function is to digest food. If this is true, I wonder, was it really worth being born? We identify ourselves as little kittens. We look at ourselves in the mirror and rarely see a lion in our reflection. Instead, we perceive ourselves as empty, full of insecurities, convinced that we are not capable of doing anything. It is as if we act within a fixed frame of time and space. It is not surprising that someone ends up in a clinic. The first thing they ask is, "What is your name? Where are you?" There are multiple time scales. For example, The global history of the earth and of humanity has its own I, just as I have mine. Life can be compared to a school day of the week. We are that, the place we occupy within a balanced mind. This happens when a person is clear about where he is, when, despite all the contradictions and circumstances, he manages to recognize his reality. This, personally, brings me happiness. Take a picture of yourself and ask yourself, where will I be in 24 months? How did I get here? Who am I really? Over this time, your body will have changed hundreds of times, including your skin and everything else. Your worldview may have been open and flexible at one time, but now the romanticism seems to have become obsolete or even irrelevant. Then you change your perspective again, leading you to think that all of this is part of a single identity, except for the passport, and we continue to trust the world. We talk about how we understand the world, and we do so because we have direct access to it through a door in our brain.